Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 2. At that time I lived in a boarding house up on Utah Street. The house was one of those that seemed small on the street but went back forever and a day deeper than most houses are wide. I figured that it had gotten built when Victoria was still queen because of the sort of wallpaper patterns. The woodwork contained all sorts of details and fiddly bits that the Victorians so adored. They overdecorated so much because they had servants. If you had to clean such a thing yourself, you would swear at the architect and never again contemplate the prettiness of that intricate hideousness. I woke late in the morning, my sleep unhindered by the bright daylight that fought through the heavy drapes. In addition to the wallpaper, Mrs. Wallace had kept all the Victorian textiles, including the curtains that were heavy beyond measure. Whenever I closed those curtains, I barely knew night from day. My grandmother would have felt at home in this place, disapproving of the new fashions. Lace and light were now the rage, but Mrs. Wallace's immigrant soul could not admit such new notions. There was something moral about heavy curtains, just as there was something moral about clean clothes on Sunday. I shared that boarding house with any number of women. I did not do this by choice, nor would I choose such a situation again. I had been broke when I found this place, and Mrs. Wallace was willing to trade work for rent. So I signed up for mediocrity. During Saturday and Sunday mahjong games, those women failed to engage me in their tedious conversations, most of which concerned who they would like to marry, which really meant who they wanted to sleep with, and that meant far too much time spent discussing the sexiness of Rudolph Valentino and the utter worthlessness of money. The girls themselves mostly worked in whatever department store would have them. They seemed to run in an eternal circle of changing jobs, going from one store to the next. The restless ones would leave, then slowly convince all the other girls to come over to their new department, whereupon they would get restless and the whole cycle would begin again. If they were fortunate, they earned enough beyond room and board to send money home. In a few respects, I was lucky. By waking late, I had some small chance of accessing the bathroom, although even then their innate talent for running late or forgetting work sometimes left them lingering in the room until noon. I could say nothing for their education. They could do grade school math presumably, read film magazines certainly, and write basic letters using the alphabet, although their ability to string those letters into words, let alone sentences and paragraphs, challenged their innate talents. These days, when I hear that letter writing is a lost art, I must wonder if it was ever found in the first place. In that last description I am too cruel. Those women, although shallow, were not stupid. Their families had them working in shops in order to bring in money. In many ways, those were the luckier girls. They could work in shops and department stores. I've worked with too many women who assembled little parts in factories, sewed in hellish halls, scrubbed floors, and did any number of tedious tasks in order to earn their daily bread. They lived hard lives, far harder than you know. The shop girls often had 2 or 3 jobs, using what money they had earned to send hope to their families. They weren't here because they wanted to be here. This was not a life that they would choose. The dreams of every single girl took her elsewhere, usually to an altar in a pleasant house with a maid. When I found myself alone with one for a few minutes, she'd start talking about home. Although some liked the city itself, the glamour of the place had long faded in their fancies. They lived lives of long work followed by old age. Hard work was all that they ever expected, but not what they desired, any more than a man truly relished working in a slaughterhouse all day, wading through filth, never seeing the family that he worked so hard to provide for. A few of those girls had been kicked out by their families for moral reasons. The most recent examples were Dorothy and Mildred. Every Saturday night they would go out drinking, then return fighting and squabbling. I'd let them in because Mrs. Wallace trusted me with a key. After the usual row, Millie would kick Dot out, and Dot would wind up crying on my shoulder at 4 a.m. Mrs. Wallace never had any real idea what those two were really up to, but if she ever got suspicious, I said, "They're arguing about boys again." That made sense to Mrs. Wallace, so she settled down and let Millie and Dot keep living there. That all brings me to the next day. The phone rang while I was shaving. I thought nothing of it, as I had few friends, and none of them had telephones as far as I was aware. The only people likely to call for me were the gentlemen on the block who occasionally played penny poker. To me, a telephone was a modern annoyance that disturbed an otherwise placid day. Anyone civilized would just knock at the door. When Mrs. Wallace yelled up to me that a man was on the phone, I immediately thought of work. Did they need me to come in for the day shift? That happened sometimes, but only if they were desperate. They had a far harder time filling my late shift than they had filling the day. They preferred keeping reliable me where reliability mattered. Mrs. Wallace had the phone sitting down in the kitchen so that she always knew when her boarders were using it and what they were talking about. She had heard vague rumors that sometimes women have unacceptable conversations on the telephone and saw this public arrangement as encouraging moral behavior, for all conversation would need to be kept polite and respectable. The lacy doily that the phone sat on reinforced this notion that one should stay clean and proper on the phone. I walked down the back staircase in my robe, my face half foamed. "Hello?" I asked, expecting to hear my boss. Mrs. Wallace still had one of those phones where you held the earpiece up to your ear. To my incredulity, Slow Joe rambled back. "Hey Bird, remember me? I met you last night. You know, I need a favor. I'm stuck. Here's the deal. I said that I would meet my sister for lunch down at Hutzler's department store, then a game cropped up. You know how it is. I can't stand my sister up, so I need you to keep her company." "I can't," I replied, lying. "I have to go to work. If I don't show up, I get fired." Slow Joe remained unperturbed, speaking like a steamroller. "Don't worry about that. I already called your boss. I told him that Mrs. Paget needs a favor from you. He owes my boss some money, so what's he going to do? I'll be by in a few minutes to pick you up." With the click of the hang-up, I swore out loud. "Language," stated Mrs. Wallace. She treated me with more respect than the girls, partly because she expected less of men, but mostly because she knew how responsible and proper I was, but that never stopped her from correcting me. I'm not one to swear, but that stunt made me lose my temper. I really had no idea who this man was, less of an idea who this Mrs. Whoever was, and I most certainly cared nothing about his sister. She could rot in hell as far as I was concerned. Sitting at a table listening to the latest gossip counted as cruel and unusual punishment. It seemed to me that only the government was forbidden such tactics, not my fellow countrymen. Packing immediately was the thing to do. I could start a new identity. I knew all the tricks to disappear into a crowd, and I already had new papers hidden away. When I got to the train, I would be a whole new man with no baggage but my duffel bag, ready to start a new life in a new town. With my respectable demeanor and average looks, I would find a job, settle in, and soon be forgotten. As I rushed upstairs, I thought twice about bolting. Joe was a sharp guy despite his pedestrian demeanor. Looking out the back window, I saw Fancy Charlie reading a newspaper in the back alley. Joe was already a step ahead of me. Damn Joe. I shook as I finished shaving, thankful to the inventor of the safety razor, otherwise I'd have slit my own throat. If Joe was going to herd me along, I was going to get herded with pride. At this point, it was the only thing that I had any power over. Only after I was properly dressed did I walk out the front door to find Joe sitting in his car and reading the sports page. The Negro League Legions had wrapped up a sweep of 3 games over the Persians, ending the series with a shutout. It was a bad opening for the Persians. On seeing me, Joe honked the horn twice. "Who knew I'd see you again, Bird? Get in." He motioned to the back of his car. I let myself in like I belonged there, stretching out in the back seat. I had to admire that car. It was a Fairlight Pharaoh. Those things had modern steam generators with more power than I could calculate. I had worked on an advertising campaign for them a few years back where we all got to drive one around and feel the hand of God on the accelerator. Joe pulled the car out, stopping to pick up Charlie moseying out of the alley, then zoomed into traffic without looking. "I used to be a cabbie," Joe said. "It was a good job. People paid me to go everywhere. Now I'm a driver for the Baroness, and she pays me to drive everywhere and do stuff. She even gives me a bump every week to keep up with inflation. You can't beat that. Back in the war, I drove around a colonel for a while, but he got himself demoted for being too truthful. He got himself shipped to Ypres, the damned fool. You ever go overseas?" I almost asked about his stories, then decided against it. No, I volunteered, then learned to train gun crews on how to shoot howitzers. Every day we would fire guns, then I added up lots of numbers, threw them out, then invented new numbers for other people to add to reports. I tried to get it transferred, but my CO knew that I was the only one who could cook the books and make him look good. I was just a rung in his go-nowhere career. The man couldn't get promoted during a war. Joe kept turning around to talk as he drove. "Yeah, don't it always work that way? Hey Bird, I'm Slow Joe. It's slow as in gin, not slow as in slow. Just so you know. That bird over there is Fancy Charlie. He used to be a monk. You can't take the Catholic out of Catholics. He can make anyone look good except me. He's been trying, God knows, but I'm a special case. We Anglicans are hopeless. At this point, I presented Joe with my latest alias. I'm John Johnson. That wasn't my real name, of course. It wasn't even a good name, but it was the only one I could think of last time I changed names. That ain't no good name. Jack's better than John. It's catchy. You got two Johns, so you get two Jacks. Jack Jackson. You can put that on your stories. Double Jack. That's a pair. That'll win you a lot of cards. Do you like cards? Yeah, of course you like cards. Almost as good as baseball. I'd say that you're a bridge man myself. Am I right or am I right? He was right. Not by choice. I prefer whist or spades. I'll play anything happily except poker. I don't like poker, but sometimes I play it anyway. Joe was driving one-handed now. He let go of the wheel to adjust a valve. Charlie here's a bridge player too. He wins some pocket money playing. The church ladies only have so much money, so he doesn't make much. I can take it or leave it. There's not enough money in it for me to bother. Hell, I can't even figure out how to score or which score is the real score. Rubbers for tires, if you know what I mean. I knew what he meant. Understanding how to keep score in contract bridge seemed as specialized as being a pitcher in baseball. For my entire unpleasant bridge playing career, there had always been some table that had to ask about scoring, no matter how experienced the players were. If life was just bridge, I think that I could have figured everything out, but life isn't just one game, it's many games, with each person playing their own game. You never knew how to play the game of life because you never knew what game the other person was playing, nor how close they were to winning or losing. At some point you just stopped caring. You can only pay so much attention to anything, and like most people, I just paid attention to how much I was winning, or at least not losing. Nice car, I said to Joe, immediately realizing my error. Inviting Joe to talk was like inviting a bomb to explode. Yeah, I love these pharaohs. These steamers are getting a bad rap. The Baroness's neighbor was all into the new Egyptian fashion and bought this car to go with her redecorating. Then all of a sudden anything Egyptian was pagan, or so the church said, even if pharaohs are biblical, and next thing you knew folks were dumping these things. The Baroness got this for free. The next year Fairlight changed the car's name to the Exodus, for when you really need to get out of town fast. Those are some clever fellas, right? I love that phrase. Charlie nodded in agreement. I held my tongue as I had written that slogan. I don't remember anything in particular after that. Slow Joe proceeded to talk my ears off about baseball. The major league season hadn't begun, but he was already figuring who would be in the playoffs and who would win. He knew exactly where and how he would place his money more precisely than most mathematicians I knew. As time went by, I would soon understand that his numbers were fairly meaningless. He still lost on baseball, horses, cards, bingo, and most any other game that you could bet on. The man loved numbers, but he couldn't figure out the good ones from the bad ones. As we pulled up outside of Hutzler's department store, there was no parking, so Joe just stopped in the middle of the street. The lady in the car behind him honked in annoyance, striving to get around him despite the continuous flow of traffic. Joe turned around and gave her the finger while he talked to me. Cymbeline is inside. She's the prettiest girl there. She'll be writing out a stack of invitations if I know her. Then he pushed $10 into my hand. Keep the change. The man was insane. Inflation, Joe said. Accurate in his prediction, Cymbeline sat at a table for two with a stack of invitations on one side of her and a stack of envelopes on the other. She fluidly wrote out addresses as she waited. Joe wasn't kidding about the pretty part either. She looked like a woman straight out of an advertising illustration. As a wife, she would be perfect for every entertainment situation, be it a pot roast for the boss or the perfect birthday party for the children. Those wide white collars so popular back then only emphasized the fairness of her face. Are you Cymbeline? I asked, feeling like a fool's fool. The woman barely looked up when I spoke, blue eyes colder than I expected, blue like ice. She showed neither confusion nor surprise, speaking like a songbird, making me rethink that the eyes were blue like the sky. No need to apologize. You can sit down and relax. My brother always does this. He sends me out every Thursday so that he and Charlie can get some private time in the apartment, if you know what I mean. I didn't know how to respond to that. She continued her patter. So where did he find you? A warehouse. I'm a receiving clerk. Her sigh of futility told me everything. Barely literate, but that's better than most. You can talk to me if you like, but I'm afraid that I'm not as interesting as you think I am. Just order me a BLT and coffee when the waitress comes around. Keep the change. He did give you money, didn't he? Yes, this woman knew exactly what was going on. I unrolled that bill from my hand, placing it on the table. Cymbeline was already back to writing out her invitations. The paper looked fancy, so I could reasonably surmise that she was writing them out for someone else, maybe that baroness that I kept hearing about. I had heard of girls who would do social tasks for pocket money, since rich women did not prefer the tedious work. Cymbeline's penmanship astonished me. She held her hand out over that nothingness on the paper, and then in an instant of pure magic, ink created beauty. Such writing convinced me that God must have written those first words across the sky, Fiat Lux, and so the Milky Way had been born in a stroke of divine ink. I must have been staring too hard at her hands. As Cymbeline wrote, she occasionally looked up at me a little too long, catching my eyes. I could see gears rolling around in her head. She would frown, then look back down, fluidly writing out another name and address. Whatever was in her head, she kept dismissing it. I felt almost safe when she slowly looked up again, this time with more purpose. She tried to make it seem polite, but I knew something was going on in there. She looked at my eyes like I looked at her writing. When her brain clicked, she stared a little too long at me as if to be sure, then winked, placing her finger upside her nose as a sign of secrecy. I have seen you before. It's John, isn't it? We should really catch up. Here, let me get my things. We'll move to someplace quieter. She methodically put her work into her bag as I dug a pit into my own stomach. I feared the worst despite her assurances, so remaining calm was all to my advantage. To keep up appearances, I helped Cymbeline put on her coat like a gentleman should, then she spent a few seconds donning one of those atrocious helmet hats. My editor tells me that they are called cloche hats. At least she hadn't bobbed her hair. If everything went well, I would be able to go my own way when our conversation was done. Afterwards I would go home, pack my bags, and hop the first train out of town because I knew better than to stick around. Cymbeline took my arm like a woman charmed by knowing a secret. There's a hot dog vendor out on the sidewalk. You can afford a hot dog, can't you? The cart steamed, keeping its hot dogs and buns warm on that coolish spring day, yesterday's rain having blown away the smog. Cymbeline had me walk forward to the cart as she remained upwind. Too many smells, she said. So I bought a couple dogs for each of us, piling sauerkraut and pickle relish on mine. She preferred vinegar. The vendor charged me more than the posted prices because nobody charged the posted price. The price freeze legislation was a joke. With dogs in hand, we retreated to the steps of a nearby building, nicely warm in the spring sun. The breeze gusted by a little cool, some of yesterday's cold still left in it, aiming to push me into her. Away from prying ears, Cymbeline leaned in familiarly so that even the pigeons would not hear. So what's the world's smartest wizard doing talking to my brother? Nailed. Yes, she had me exactly right. That pit in my stomach now stretched to the earth's core. I sighed. Fate had a sense of humor. Judging by Cymbeline's response, I should be safe for today. I kept my voice low as well. To be honest, I felt relieved at not having to lie. I'm earning money. I'm much happier, to be honest. It's a long story. So tell me. She seemed earnest, not hostile. She had that air of an old friend, one you hadn't seen since school. I don't even know you. I didn't. I would remember a face that pretty. Cymbeline gave me that icy stare again. I never learned how she could go from summer to winter with those eyes. Like the winter, you only felt warm while you were in the light. If I wanted to out you, I would have done it back there, but I didn't, did I? And if you got caught now, the church would examine all of us back to front and inside out. That would be dumb of me now, wouldn't it? So we're just here, you and me, nobody's on the steps. It doesn't get any safer than this, does it? How could I put my life into words? I've struggled for years to do that. If not for my editor, you wouldn't be reading this story now. I had to get out of there, out of school. I really did. It was complicated, but really I had to get out. No matter what the papers and the rumor mill said, I had no talent. Do you remember everything that I was supposed to become? All those grand titles that I was expected to inherit? Bringer of mankind to a new age? Nada. Nothing. I couldn't make a light bulb glow. I couldn't divine that tomorrow is Friday. I couldn't even warm up leftovers. I was a fraud, and I'd had enough of it. One day I was there teaching to a half-empty class where so many had already volunteered, and I realized just how empty I was. Inside, I had already left. That was it. I walked out and joined the army. She vociferously disagreed. But you weren't a total fraud. You really did enter university at 10 and have a PhD by 15. That's brilliant. More embarrassment. Oh yeah, I could do the academic work. I understood the nature of magic like nobody else but those who can't do teach, and I certainly proved that truism. I was a professor of computational thaumaturgy. I didn't need to have any power to do that. All I had to do was sift through the archives as I was told and write pointless papers, learning math because I could. To be honest, all I was contributing to my field was meaningless theories on meaningless topics. It was a lie. As it was, disappearing saved my life. I wasn't rounded up. Nobody knows I'm here. Cymbeline nodded at that. Independence had made the life of a known wizard quite dangerous. With the communists passing anti-wizard laws, those of us with money or means fled the country, while those of us who couldn't hid. Bit by bit, the Communist Party and the Church were catching up with us, giving the citizenry the spectacle of a public trial, then locking us away in Judas Iscariot. It wasn't burning at the stake anymore. Electrocution was the modern thing. I did not want to become one of those ever-growing number of cooked corpses, especially as no wizard had been found lately while the public was getting restless for blood. A wizard's only real hope was a pile of money and a good lawyer, and I had neither. How had you even recognized me? You came to visit my school once. You came to visit the girls' theosophical school. I'm afraid that I scowled at that name. The first thing that flashed into my mind were those awful dances that I had been subjected to. The second thing that flashed into my mind was the theosophers, little better than spiritualists, but far more ignorant because they were so sure of their knowledge. At least the spiritualists knew that they were fakers. To their benefit, almost nobody else took the theosophers seriously. Cymbeline continued her explanation. My roommate was at the top of the class, so she got to escort you about. Don't you remember Sophia? I didn't recall anyone by that name. You were a theosopher. I still am. I have an ear, you might say. I might not remember your face, but I remember your voice. I'm good at remembering voices. I'd love to say that I recognized your aura, but I never learned to do that. Auras were theosophist claptrap. Auras. I said that in the wrong tone of voice. Cymbeline gave me her biting look. With all that's gone on, you wizards still look down on us? You have the nerve. Habit, I responded, calmer this time. We used to slam everyone mercilessly, especially ourselves. You should have heard Clark's diatribes against the other faculty. I'm surprised their ears didn't ignite. I hope that you're better than that now. Down here we don't need more of that. We're all family, or we all pretend to be family. We find each other except who we find, and that's the way that it goes. Can you do that? I shrugged. I don't know. It's been a long time. Jobs don't last long, you know. I don't know what I said after that. I suppose that I ranted on about frequently changing jobs. That was the nature of keeping my head low. I could get a job just about anywhere, and now I would need another one. Soon the mobsters would know, and then I would be in bad trouble. They charged you money to stay quiet. I couldn't rely on Cymbeline keeping my secrets, for secrets have a way of rearing back to life like a hydra, especially with large bounties involved, and me, I had no torches. Seeing the time, Cymbeline made ready to leave. I had one last question though. I thought that Cymbeline was a king's name? She winked at that. My father was a nut. He always called me that. My mother could never talk him out of it. Now I have to go. The Baroness needs her invitation sent out. There's always so much to do. She has a party on Saturday, but I'm already arranging the next one. It never ends. Next Thursday? That's my day off. I'll tell Joe to bring you down if you don't show. I'll meet you here, I promised. What a fool I was. I was a damned fool. I never could see a relationship that would go nowhere, even when the winter winds blew.